Hello, everybody. Hi. Hello. I've come from a long way, so be nice to me. I'm a little bit nervous, but have you noticed the people who always say I'm nervous on stage, kill it? Because that's what's going to happen today. I'm going to just kill it, be amazing. You'll talk about this for decades and preserve it online. So my name is Jepchumba, and I said I've come from Kenya. And I wanted to start this talk actually with a memory that I still have. I was way too young when I watched this movie called Day After. It was made the year I was born, but somehow it made its way into a social studies class and terrorized me forever. It's basically a film about the end of the world. It's this nuclear apocalypse, and there's singed skies and glowing in the dark skeletons and people running all over. And I used to have nightmares about it until one day I all of a sudden had some relief, realizing that this movie never ever would take place in Africa, because Africa is generally left out in science fiction movies, in post-apocalyptic conversations. So for a long time I thought I'm pretty much spared, the apocalypse, haha, good luck guys. I came to realize that in many ways, Africa, where I come from, had experienced a different type of apocalypse. And this wasn't a cultural apocalypse that was a remnant of colonialism. And I inherited an Africa where we don't know much about what happened to us before the British came. We've lost so many of our languages, our histories, our traditions. Our education system reflects a dark remnant past where we were told we're savages, we're primitive, we're underdeveloped, we come from this dark continent, the other frontier before the final frontier. The final frontier sounds much more exciting sometimes. But we were the other frontier before space. And I come from this twisted legacy where new political boundaries were formed, new alliances were forged based on basically arbitrary foreign decisions. It's kind of taking on colonialism is kind of a big, huge subject, and you can take courses on it, and I encourage that, and I'm not going to give you a course on colonialism. But I wanted to make this much more personal and actually less abstract by just bringing it back to my favorite subject, which is me. So my grandparents worked and lived in reservations in the Great Rift Valley in Kenya. And they undertook this colonial enterprise where they burnt away all their possessions and took on Christianity. They discarded their clothes, their jewelry, their traditions, and memories for the promise that this colonial project would save them one day and they would have a ticket to the kingdom of heaven. And as a result, I was taught that the only thing that I could keep was my mother tongue, which I would soon lose because I was put into missionary schools and foreign schools, giving me this amazing accent that you're hearing today. And I was taught that anything outside of this pre-described form of colonialism was unacceptable. And the church and also these traditional institutions were really the cultural nuclear bomb that took place in many countries within Africa. And also, by the way, I'm speaking about Africa, the most diverse place in the world, with 53 plus nations. So if anything you hear is what? It's because I'm set up to fail. Come on, how am I supposed to speak on behalf of such a massive space? But I try to every day, so you can wish me luck on that. So asking questions when I grew up about the past was seen as witchcraft because we had the good word of God. Having a critical mind was seen as witchcraft because we should live by faith. And this is not only something that was something from religion, it also poured into our hospitals, into our schooling, into our churches, into our interactions. And being Africa meant that you were a third world citizen. And in order to succeed in this world, you would have to aspire to Western ideals as closely as possible, which meant that, it was suggested to me that perhaps I should straighten my hair or bleach my skin or learn as much as Western civilization as I could so that I could actually become a successful person. And sometimes I think about that and it's oh, yeah. But thankfully, I'm not a person who follows the rules, and this isn't because of me. I come from a long line of rebellious women. So I'm very fortunate for that, for having that in the back of my mind. So going back to the topic today, which is digital colonialism and erasure, on the internet, I'm known as Digital African, and I run this website called African Digital Art. In fact, most of the slides are artwork that is featured on the website, so I encourage you to go to africandigitalart.com. We feature and showcase digital art projects from Africa and the diaspora. And from a very young age, I was fascinated by the internet because it allowed me to become and be whoever I was. It allowed me to connect to other people, and most importantly, it allowed me to give other people a different view of Africa that was outside of this war-torn, diseased, like damned, poverty-stricken continent that only offered like raw materials and the Lion King. But like many of you here today, you know that the promise of the internet has become something else. Don't get me wrong, the internet is pretty amazing, you know. It's the reason why I'm here. I connect with you guys, and you guys know about what I do. And, you know, not only has it been amazing in terms of giving me opportunities to do something that I'm passionate about, but it also has given me the opportunities to know more about my African neighbors. Within Africa, it's extremely expensive to even travel to like your neighborhood countries, or to even know what's happening in Benin. Like most of us like have no clue what's happening on the other side of the continent. So the internet has given us opportunities to do that. But we're quickly learning today that the most absurd assumption that we can make is that technology is neutral. And I think the second most absurd assumption that we can make is that colonialism and imperialism is something of the past. Today I want to really talk about what digital colonialism looks like, not only for me, but also for you, that you don't know you're experiencing it, and the erasures that we're having that actually make this call about updating seem much more urgent than just a suggestion for a nice title for a conference. So I hope that after this I can suggest maybe a couple of ways of how we can update as creators, as innovators, as documentarians, and storytellers. So it turns out that the World Wide Web is not so much worldwide. The internet is primarily in English. 60% of all web content is in English, while only about 10% of the human population speaks English, I think, yes. And I'm reminded of this quote by this artist and musician, Brian Eno, and he says that there is not enough Africa in computers. And I actually believe that this is to be true whenever I type on my QWERTY keyboard. I always think about like how limiting it is like to experience technology, to even experience the World Wide Web in a very specific way. And you know, language has been proven by, you guys are very smart people, like languages has proven to be a very powerful tool when it comes to innovation in terms of technology and understanding of humanity and the world and the things that is important to us. And in Africa alone, there's 2,000 languages. In my country, in Kenya, there's more than 48 languages in a very teeny tiny place. But the way we're experiencing this new World Wide Web is only through this one lens, which I feel like, hey, come on. So the internet has also become this breeding ground for unchecked spread of bipolarism. We have like lost complete nuance. Like I've unfriended so many friends and then refriended them again and unfriended and refriended and then like hang out with them and like, you're fine, I'll keep you. But then if you say one more thing on Facebook. And we've devolved into shouting matches when in the past the internet was this place for weirdos. Like how many of you guys remember going to really strange chat rooms, having really strange conversations and rubbing up against people who you didn't necessarily agree with or like share the same, you know, principles and ideas and ideals. So for me, like this, in this guise of progressiveness, we've really turned ourselves into shouting matches of Team A and Team B, and actually lost a lot of who we were. And this is a form of digital colonialism. And the internet also was hailed as a space for communities. where we celebrated our intricacies and eccentricities. That's a very long word. But due to models of online economic business models, we have transformed ourselves from people into users and into products. And this is nothing new for some of you. Some of you know how much do you go for as a human being online? Does anybody know? So the average person goes for around $4.84 a year in advertising. So you have a market value to who you are. But this is even stranger for somebody like me coming from Africa, where we're completely ignored because we don't have Apple Pay and credit cards. So, you know, people assume, like, you don't want to watch this show because you can't pay for it. And actually, one of the things that this is reminding me of is there was a humongous, amazing PBS special on African history and civilization. And in Kenya, I can't even watch that, you know, and it's about things that I would want to know, you know, about African history and civilization. So this also applies into, like, social media as well. Like, countries like Nigeria had over 20 million plus users on Facebook, but it's only 4 to 5 years ago that Facebook said, I think there's some people who might be interested in Facebook, you know. So this is something that's quite concerning. What is also alarming of how Africa is left out of the conversation, it's when it comes to discussions like that we're having today. We're rarely invited into conversation that will inevitably affect us. And this is also important when we're talking about things that, like, we're all debating about and having really heart-to-heart things that, you know, will end up changing how we behave, how we interact. For example, the future of the internet, artificial intelligence, digital preservation. These are the conversations that we have to be part of because we represent so much of what's going on in the world. The system of digital colonialism has turned many even African innovators into consumers rather than actually engaging in this conversation about technology. In a country like Nigeria, they import 90% of all of the software that they use in their country, and the top 100 IT companies in Nigeria are just set up to maintain these the software that isn't made for them or thought, like, nobody, a lot of the software that is made or never ever considered that it would be used in other spaces outside of the West. And so what ends up happening is that you see the amount of money and resources that are poured into creating useless apps that, like, have no social productive use in African context being spread around all the time. And what is worse is that when we innovate in Africa, we are rarely given credit for it. As an example, 10% of applications for IP rights and registration rights are made by African citizens and residents, and 90% of applications for the registration of IP rights are made by foreign applicants. So it kind of sounds familiar? Like it's like a remnant of a very old past. This is the thing that actually makes my stomach hurt. And it's about basically what's happening, which is the system of knowledge, which continues to reflect this old colonial past and legacy, where knowledge is not evenly distributed. So when I read the call for this, when I read about this, the topic for today, I was like, oh, wow, I wish we had more problems like how do we preserve content? Because what happens is that there's not much content that's going on in terms of who has access to share online. It's all usually favors like very specific places on Earth. And it's a very scary map. It's the uneven coverage of Wikipedia. Like most Wikipedia entries come from a very specific place in the world. So most knowledge is coming from a very specific place in the world. And that should make us actually worry and stop congratulating ourselves for being innovators, because we are doing basically the same thing that we've always done. And we should really, really think about how we approach knowledge and how we approach the distribution of knowledge. And I think what I come to realize more and more as I Google things, I try to find information about the things that I'm learning, is that we're living in an information age, but we know basically nothing. Like, we don't know that much. And then the thing is that what's even more dangerous is that we assume that it's going to always be there. It's at our fingertips, or like this is reliant. So we have like work to do, guys. Woohoo. It's exciting. In 1981, this guy, Tom McPhail, spoke about electronic colonialism. He almost seemed prophetic about it. And he said that the world would experience a new concept of empire that wouldn't really necessarily be based so much on military power or land acquisition, but more on like psychological and mental imperialism. And digital colonialism is dangerous because what it inevitably leads to is the control and subjugation of our imaginations. So when we have all of these kind of problems happening online and the internet, and we're not having as wildly shared accessibility to knowledge, what happens is like we start limiting what we can actually think for the future. I used to think that imagination was, having the ability to think critically and creatively, but I've come to realize that imagination is actually much more powerful, because imagination is the most powerful thing that you could do, because it generates a new reality. And so if our imagination is only limited within certain spaces and forgetting other parts of the world, then what kind of world are we imagining? So to me, the topic of update or dying is much more urgent. To me, the need to adapt or perish online is not only about preserving what we already have online in the form of creative works and knowledge, but our call is much more significant. We have to be vigilant as leaders to not only archive, but to create and support new perspectives, new spaces, inviting new voices from people from other side of the world like me. And they're not as cool as me, but they're almost the same. So only then we will finally have the chance to realize the full power and potential of this amazing thing that we love, and we can shift our thinking and also generate new possibilities and offer new alternatives to what we already face today. And what we already face today does not look too great. It's actually quite frightening. Like, we have so many crises and we don't necessarily have solutions for them, but it can only help if we have more voices and more perspectives involved. So how I think about this in terms of my approach and how I approach my work, and how I also approach this when I'm speaking to other artists, the African artists, whether they're digital artists or not, is that I always invite people to think about 100 years from now, like to become kind of like an architect. Architects have a unique position because they have the ability to think that their work is going to last 100 plus years from now, that people are going to stare at your building, so come on. Yeah, do something that people will appreciate. And I think that because we're in this new medium, we think we have to always be the most popular, and we always have to be the most recent. And I think if we shift from thinking, let's always try to be the most recent, most popular, but let's start having conversations with people 100 years from now, we can really, really already embed digital preservation in everything that we do. So that's what I do. I have conversations with people in the future. I'm not crazy, I'm just smart. And I always think about like what messages would I leave for a generation that I will never meet. And I think that's what we have to do as preservers of the internet. So in closing, I want to leave you something behind. Africa is the youngest continent in the world. We have a population of 200 million people between the age of 15 and 24. So what this actually means is that at the end of the century, Africa will be 40% of the world's population, which will equal Asia. And that means it's also 4 times the share of North America and Europe put together. So this world is going to look very, very different, whether you want it to or not. And we have no choice but to update or die. We can change how we experience the internet right now, because what we're doing right now is going to affect what's going to happen in the next 85 years. And that's like the most exciting space to be in. So, and we can do that right now by inviting more African innovators, more African thinkers, more African philosophers, and actually, forget even African philosophers, people who are not usually in these conversations. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me. And you can find out more information about me online and more about African digital art. Like I said, all the work on the slides that were shown on these presentations are artists that we featured on africandigitalart.com. Thank you, guys.